Okay, thanks for joining us for our conversation with Julius Krein. Julius is the founder of American Affairs, a quarterly journal that he started in 2017 after the inauguration that year. Before doing that, Julius had a career in finance. We are here to see if we can talk to Julius briefly about an article that he wrote for the Giving Review symposium of articles called Conservatism and the Future of Tax-Incentivized Philanthropy. Julius's article in particular was entitled, "What Do Conservative Donors Want?" Well, why don't we talk, Julie? Why don't we let you tell us what, maybe two or three of the main points of your contribution were?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, thank you for inviting me to write the piece, and thank you for having me on today. There's sort of three key points to the piece. The first one is that conservative politics, Republican Party, however you want to describe it, seems to be in a state of intellectual and policy disarray. There hasn't been a party platform for the last two election cycles. And even beyond that, increasingly see a bunch of kind of half-baked policy ideas being thrown out from time to time in the name of the party, whether it's sunsetting all federal legislation in 5 years, cutting Social Security, replacing all taxes with a 30% consumption tax. Whatever you think of those things, we can get into it if you want, but they're frequently being just thrown out with no real analysis, no real plan for implementation. And no one in the party wants to avow them or run on them. So I think I basically start with that intellectual disarray in the party, and I think you have to attribute some of the blame for that to the kind of directionless nature of conservative philanthropy for the last few years, maybe decades. And I basically discuss kind of two phenomena. On the one hand, conservative donors seem to know what they want, but they can't admit it. And that is basically wealth preservation, low taxes, to sum it up. And instead of really connecting that to real national policy goals, they've kind of created this myth of the perfect immaculate market and reduced all policy into this, basically we have to preserve the purity of the market. And in the process, a lot of serious policy work gets lost. I mean, after all, we have a government, you're going to have taxes. Is it better to have an income tax or a financial transaction tax or a tariff, various other things? A lot of that is just completely missing from a lot of conservative policy work. And again, that's how you end up with these kind of half-baked ideas in disarray. The other point that I make in the article is that, on the one hand, conservative donors know what they want, but they can't admit it. But in another respect, they don't really know what they want. And that's particularly true with respect to cultural agenda items. You have a number of very large donors who are outspoken, I think, in their desire to basically eliminate most, if not all, of the conservative cultural baggage, to use perhaps the terms they would use to describe it, and essentially get rid of social conservatism and just focus on low taxes or whatever. And then you have another group of donors that seem very interested in social conservatism, though I think it's worth pointing out that they never really want to use the government or spend any money for it. But they're at least nominally committed to social conservatism. But the two don't really seem to know what they want or come together and able to enable the formation of an agenda that, at the very least, Mitch McConnell would want to run on. And that's really kind of the essence of the article. Aside from that, I guess it's a request for donors to figure out what they want a little bit more proactively if they want to have a conservative movement or a political right that's not incoherent and ineffective.
Did conservative donors know better what they want in, I'll say, the 70s and 80s, leading up to the 70s, I guess is what I really mean. Leading up to 80, there was an intellectual infrastructure which would have had a coherent set of binders worth of proposals behind Reagan when what happened? Were they caught off guard by Trump? Is that a defense of them, or I guess it's a critique of them if they weren't so caught off guard.
Yeah, I guess I would answer that question in a couple different ways. One, in the 70s and 80s, the same tensions were all there. The libertarians and the traditionalists had plenty of debates and fights, but I think the common enemy in Soviet communism and a real geopolitical threat kind of allowed a lot of those quarrels to be suppressed, and the formation of a more or less coherent alliance. Secondly, I think you actually did have some very serious policy work at that time in a way that frankly is not happening now. It wasn't just sort of Milton Friedman and the Chicago School economists, but as a friend of mine pointed out the other day, you know, there was a time when AEI had probably the best political science department in the country, with people like Irving Kristol and Walter Burns and a number of other scholars, and so on. And I just, you know, I don't think that's the case anymore.
What's been the reaction to your article, to the
Yeah.
I've shared
There've been a couple different reactions. I mean, one of them has been, you know, you shouldn't blame the donors too much because their heart's in the right place, but they just, you know, they don't have the time or the ability to necessarily follow through on a lot of this giving. To which my view is, well, that's kind of the point of the piece. I think it's correct to say, you know, in many cases that their hearts may be in the right place, but they have to do a little bit more than write the check and show up at the annual dinner and have everybody, you know, butter them up and tell them how great they are and not think about it again. I think at this particular time, it requires a little more thought about what you actually want this political philanthropy to do, particularly when it comes to setting an agenda. Another piece of feedback I got was with respect to the foundations, and that was, you know, they're just much smaller than the foundations on the left. They can't do the same things. And I think, you know, that's true at one level, but at another level, you know, there's a lot of things, at least in my limited experience, what I have seen, the left foundations are just much more proactive in building relationships and really formulating their own agenda outside of the actual size of their giving. I mean, it's not particularly uncommon, for example, for a left of center foundation or philanthropic group to call me up and ask what we're doing. They don't give us any money. I don't suspect that they want to, but they're just very interested in kind of in what's going on. I don't think I've ever had a right of center foundation call me up at all. And they seem to basically, well, I think the other side of that is, all right, maybe you can't give out 10 million grants to this or that, but then you have to think about what you actually can do. And right now they seem to be kind of operating like a late stage private equity fund when they should be operating like a early stage VC. And if you can't, you know, if you're only going to be able to give smaller amounts, then you got to look to be an angel investor and find new things where your smaller amounts can have a big impact, not just give the same amount of money to the same group of friends you've been giving it to for 30 years, regardless of performance. So that's kind of, you know, that was the other piece of feedback and my views on it. And the last one, of course, is as you published, AEI took issue with my description of a quote unquote alleged meeting that they had regarding the nature of whether they're a conservative institution or not. I'm not going to get too far into that other than to say that was based on the accounts of two independent sources, one an employee, one a major donor, and people can read what I would say is a response based on a lot of technicality and judge that for themselves. But the bigger issue I found interesting about this is, you know, I was pretty harsh on AEI in that article in terms of their policy work and things like that. No one from there complained at all about that, at least not to me. They complained only about whether they have a conservative branding or not. And I think that's indicative of a much larger problem in conservative philanthropy, where people seem very interested in, you know, the branding and this kind of general sort of, are we conservative? What is conservatism question? Much less interested in actually formulating or implementing a serious policy agenda.
I really mean to ask is, I guess I don't, is philanthropy too politicized? by their of you, I actually do mean to ask, is conservative philanthropy too politicized? Did Trump so roil the waters that that's affecting the way in which people would answer the question you just raised, as well as the time horizon of their philanthropic investments in policy and intellectual infrastructure for a movement?
I mean, in general, I think it's fair to say that American philanthropy is probably too politicized, though I sort of just take that as a given reality. I don't see that changing necessarily, or what could be done to change that. What I think is the case among conservative philanthropy is that they sort of operate, the irony of it is, given a lot of conservative hostility to identity politics, conservatism essentially operates like an aggrieved identity group, and essentially they want people to sort of validate them and their identities, rather than actually operate as a really effective political movement that has multiple layers of policy work and the ability to really coordinate policy and implement policy.
Just in case you haven't angered conservative donors enough, let me ask you to maybe go.
I've given up on getting money from them. So
yeah, okay. Implicit though in your, do you think they're smarter than they really are, is my question of you? Because you're saying if they brought in their intelligence to bear and led better, I guess, or more actively, things would be different and have a different outcome for conservatism in the country. There's a lot of grantees out there who would think, we know how to run a think tank and they don't. Why don't you let us do it?
In my view, the donors are actually much smarter than the people they give money to, or maybe the kind of people that they hire to be the gatekeepers and overseers of their giving. I don't think that's particularly surprising. And, I wouldn't want to speculate on the correlation between intelligence and wealth, but as they say, a fool and his money are quickly parted. So if you're able to be a donor, you're probably much smarter than the people you're giving money to. And, I guess I would encourage them to think about that a little bit more. And if they're not, if they're not going to be really serious about political giving, then, go ahead and build an art museum or whatever. I feel like there's a kind of, they've sort of outsourced a lot of this to people that have not done a particularly good job.
Right. Okay. I mean, you say political giving, which just gives me pausing. Do you mean policy oriented giving, or do you mean both political and policy oriented? Or are you
I was referring to sort of policy philanthropy,
yeah.
not necessarily which candidates you give money to. Yeah.
And then this is, I guess, another version of the same question. If it's the case that a business mindset is brought to bear on one's giving, and here I do mean policy-oriented giving, won't it be too short-term? Isn't a business mindset, because of the rules of business, for the most part, too short-term and not a decades-long, long march through the institutions type of worldview?
I think there's a balance here. Certainly, you want to give the recipients of your philanthropy enough time to complete their projects, but when you start talking in terms of decades, that's a very long runway and allows for a lot of abuse. At least in my opinion, it already has. And I think identifying appropriate intermediate milestones and ways to evaluate that. There are many things you can do to sort of keep track of this, but certainly just allowing things to run on autopilot for decades, I think that's allowing the pendulum to swing too far in the wrong direction.
And then does your piece, do you run the risk of a sort of grass is always greener thing? I think somebody on Twitter had a reaction to your article, a person of the left, man of the left, who said, hey, he was quoting the portion of your article where you said liberals are better at this and more organized, I think is what your point was. That's my paraphrase. And I think the position is, hey, the grass is always greener. Might that
well, the risk is certainly there, and I'll let people judge that for themselves. What I do think is clear to me, though, is that the Left Foundation, I certainly don't agree with the objects or their goals in many cases, but they are actually formulating their own independent set of agendas. independent of, say, left billionaires. And they're really going out and building, coalitions, including the corporate sector, including, they're bringing in government officials, they're bringing in foreign governments, they're bringing in different activist groups. They're capable of really generating their own independent set of ideas and actually building coalitions and trying to act on them. And I would say that's totally absent on the right, where if anything, the right foundations pretty much just do the exact same things that individual right-wing billionaires do. And there's a great deal of difference in their ability to actually coordinate and effectively influence policy, regardless of what you think of their ends and motives.
So your observation about what do conservative donors want this is a question, is mainly applicable to conservative donors collectively who could work cooperatively, or does it also apply to foundations individually or givers individually?
I think it applies across the board, but I think one of the reasons they have a hard time coordinating is because they don't know what they want and don't really even seem to be attempting to figure it out. Certainly a lot of the conservative business donors don't really have any interest in the cultural agenda. In many cases, they're diametrically opposed to it and quite hostile to it. And many of the sort of social conservative side, they don't really even think about trying to win those kinds of allies at all, from what I can tell. So I think, in order to do that, you have to first figure out what you really want. What areas are you willing to compromise on? What areas are you actually going to work toward? And then you can figure out what coalition you can put together. None of that thought process seems to be happening, from what I can tell.
Great, Julius. I don't know if you had an opportunity to read any of the other contributions to the symposium, or much less whether you have any reaction you'd like to share about any of them.
I'll sort of praise one that hopefully illustrates a larger point I'm trying to make. I believe it was Craig Kennedy's piece who went into a lot of details on how we should think about the regulations around philanthropy, how we should think about donor advised funds and various potential rule changes, just given the changing nature of philanthropy over the last few decades. I think that sort of very specific policy work is really missing on the right. We have a lot of people, like my essay itself, it's a lot of fun. People talk about it, but there's lots of people doing these big picture political theory kinds of pieces. We have a huge deficit when it comes to actual detailed, in the weeds, less glamorous policy work. I get calls all the time from people on the Hill, or back when there was a Trump administration, people saying, I need someone who can, someone who knows finance, who can come and help me with this thing we're doing at Treasury, or this bill we're working on. The cupboard is bare on the right. Or I need someone to run this particular economic analysis. We have no one to turn to. That is something that the left does much better. Again, whatever you think of their motives, they have an actual cadre of people that can go in and form a government. We have a very thin layer that can form the very top, but no one else doing a lot of detailed policy work. Because again, most of the policy work is just designed to prove that, hey, government is bad, let the markets run wild anyway, so you don't have to think about those things. And I think that's a huge lapse. And if I were a conservative philanthropist, I would think about putting people into places like the Texas government or red state government, something like that, develop some real governing qualifications, capabilities among a group of people that one day can govern. And we're just not doing that.
Well, Julius Krein, I think that might be a good place to finish it off. Thank you so much for your contribution to the symposium and for this conversation today.
Thank you.